Look what we have here. My father pointed at me across the reception hall, laughing, loud enough for the whole table to turn. This is the one who couldn't cut it in medicine. My mother smiled into her wine glass. My three siblings, all surgeons, all in their pressed formal wear, laughed right along with him. I smiled back. I didn't correct him, but here's what my father didn't know, standing there so pleased with his joke. The woman he'd just called a failure had, 12 years after he disowned her, built something worth more than his entire hospital's surgical department combined. This is silent revenge, for anyone whose family decided who they were before ever bothering to check whether it was true. Before we get into this one, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. These stories are only getting sharper. Tell me in the comments what your own family got wrong about you, and stay with me, because this one took 12 years to finally land. I'm Adora Whitfield. I'm 34 years old, and 12 years ago, my father, Reginald Whitfield, a renowned cardiothoracic surgeon and department chair at Ashford Regional Medical Center, disowned me for choosing culinary school over medical school. My mother, Constance, and all three of my siblings, my older sister, Odalise, an oncologist, my older brother, Marcus, a neurosurgeon, and my younger sister, Priya, an OBGYN, went along with the decision without a single word of protest, treating my choice as a betrayal of the Whitfield name rather than simply a different life, chosen deliberately by someone who understood exactly what she was walking away from. I want to explain how thoroughly medicine had defined my family before I go any further, because it matters to understanding exactly how deep the wound of that disowning actually went. My father had trained under a legendary cardiothoracic surgeon in Boston, had built his own career at Ashford Regional over 3 decades, and had raised all 4 of his children with a single, unwavering expectation woven into nearly every dinner conversation, every school project, every summer vacation built around hospital shadowing programs rather than ordinary childhood pursuits, that we would each, in our own specialty, continue the Whitfield tradition of medicine. My grandfather had been a physician. My great-grandfather had been a physician. The Whitfield name, in the small, insular medical community my father moved through, carried a specific weight that he guarded with an intensity I didn't fully understand until I tried to walk away from it. Odalise, Marcus, and Priya each fell into line with that expectation, the way water falls into a riverbed already carved for it. Each of them genuinely gifted, genuinely suited to the demands of a medical career. Each of them accepted into competitive residency programs that made my father glow with a pride he rarely extended anywhere else in his life. I was the youngest by 2 years, and for most of my childhood, I assumed I would follow the same path, dutifully taking the AP Sciences, shadowing physicians during summers, applying to the same pre-med tracks at the same competitive universities my siblings had attended before me. I remember specific moments from that childhood that, looking back, should have told me something about how narrow the family's definition of worth actually was. At 8 years old, I'd won a regional baking competition through my elementary school, a genuinely proud moment for an 8-year-old, and I remember bringing home the ribbon, expecting some version of the celebration Odalise received when she won her school's science fair that same year. My father glanced at the ribbon, said, "That's nice, sweetheart," and immediately pivoted the dinner conversation back to Odalise's science fair project, a pattern that repeated, in various forms, throughout my entire childhood. At 14, I asked for a set of proper kitchen knives for my birthday, instead of the microscope my parents had already purchased, assuming, incorrectly, that I wanted the same gift Marcus had received the year before. I got the microscope anyway, still boxed and largely unused, 3 years later, when I finally donated it to my high school. What changed for me happened slowly, across my sophomore year of college, in a way I didn't fully understand myself until much later. I'd taken an elective cooking class, almost as a joke, a stress relief credit squeezed between organic chemistry and a genetics seminar, and I remember the specific afternoon, everything shifted, standing at a stove, reducing a sauce for the first time, understanding, with a clarity I'd never once felt in a chemistry lab, that I was doing something my hands and my mind both wanted to keep doing, rather than something I was doing because 4 generations of Whitfields had decided, before I was born, exactly what my life would look like. I finished my pre-med coursework anyway, mostly out of inertia and fear, and I even sat for the MCAT during my senior year, scoring well enough to have real options, which made what came next considerably harder for my family to understand or forgive. 6 weeks before my medical school applications were due, I told my parents, Over a dinner, I still remember in exhausting detail that I wasn't applying to medical school at all. I told them I'd been quietly accepted, months earlier, to a culinary program in New York, and that I intended to go. I want to describe that dinner carefully, because it's the hinge on which the next 12 years of my life turned. My father set down his fork with a particular, controlled precision I'd seen him use before, only when discussing a failed surgery with his colleagues. "You scored a 518 on the MCAT," he said, as though the number alone should have settled the question permanently. "You're not seriously telling me you're going to go cook food instead of practicing medicine?" "I am," I told him. "I've thought about this for over a year, Dad. I don't want to be a doctor. I want to cook." My mother, Constance, who rarely contradicted my father on anything of substance, asked, quietly, whether this was some kind of rebellion. A phrase that told me, even in that moment, how completely they'd already decided my choice couldn't possibly be a genuine, considered decision on its own merits. Odalis, home from her own residency for the weekend, told me flatly that I was throwing away an opportunity most people would kill for. Marcus said nothing at all, which somehow felt worse than anything anyone else said. Priya, only 16 at the time, looked between all of us with an expression of genuine confusion, too young yet to understand the full weight of what was unfolding at that table. I want to describe Priya's role in this story a bit further, because she occupies a specific, complicated place in it that I've thought about often over the years. She was young enough, when the disowning happened, that she absorbed the family's official version of events almost entirely without question, the story that I'd thrown away a bright future for something reckless and unserious. By the time she was old enough to form her own independent judgment, 12 years of family narrative had already calcified around the story, and I understood, watching her laugh along with my father at that reception, that she'd essentially inherited a verdict about me that had been rendered before she was mature enough to actually evaluate it herself. I don't think that makes her laughter at that table any less painful in the moment, but I've come to understand it as its own kind of casualty of the situation, a 16-year-old's confused uncertainty hardening, over 12 years, into an adult's unexamined certainty, simply because nobody in the family ever thought to revisit the original story once she was old enough to question it. My father delivered his verdict 3 days later, calling me into his study the way he might call a resident in for a disciplinary review. "If you walk away from medicine," he said, "you walk away from this family's support, financially and otherwise. I've spent 30 years building something for this family to be proud of. I won't watch you throw it away and call it self-discovery." I want to be honest that I didn't fully believe, in that moment, that he meant the full weight of what he was saying. I thought it was an ultimatum designed to scare me back onto the path he wanted, not an actual, permanent severing. I was wrong. I enrolled in culinary school 6 weeks later, and within a month, my father had stopped taking my calls entirely. My mother sent one final card, that first Christmas, a brief, formal note wishing me well without any invitation to visit, and then the contact simply stopped altogether. For 12 years, extending eventually to my siblings as well, each of them falling into line with my father's judgment, the same way they'd fallen into line with his expectations their entire lives. I want to describe those 12 years honestly, because they weren't the straightforward, triumphant success story people sometimes assume when they hear how this eventually ended. The first 3 years were genuinely difficult in every sense, financially precarious, emotionally isolating, built on ramen dinners and shared apartments with 3 roommates in Outer Borough, Queens, while I worked brutal hours in professional kitchens for wages that barely covered rent. I want to be honest that there were nights, during those early years, when I wondered whether my father had been right, whether I'd thrown away a stable, respected future for something considerably harder and less certain. I remember one specific night, about 18 months into culinary school, when I'd burned my forearm badly enough during a dinner service to require stitches, exhausted, in physical pain, and utterly alone, in a way that made the isolation from my family feel unbearably sharp. I sat in that emergency room at 2 in the morning, waiting for a doctor, surrounded by the exact kind of medical environment my entire family had built their lives around, and I remember thinking, with a specific, hollow clarity, that if I called my father right then, told him I'd changed my mind, he might actually welcome me back into the fold without a single further question asked. I didn't call. I sat in that waiting room alone, got my stitches, and went back to work 3 days later, and I've come to understand that specific night as the actual turning point of my resolve, more than any single triumph that came afterward. The night I proved to myself, alone, without anyone watching, that I was capable of choosing this path, even when it offered nothing but difficulty in return. What kept me going, more than anything else, was a specific mentor I found during my second year working line cook shifts at a mid-tier bistro in the West Village. A exacting, brilliant chef named Odile Marchand, who'd trained in Lyon before immigrating and building her own career in New York from nothing. Odile saw something in me during those brutal early years that I hadn't fully seen in myself. A specific instinct for balancing flavor and structure that she told me more than once couldn't be taught, only recognized and refined. I want to describe Odile's own story briefly, because it shaped how she mentored me more than I understood at the time. She'd grown up in a working-class Lyon suburb, the daughter of a factory worker, who'd considered her interest in cooking a frivolous distraction from more serious employment. An old disapproval she recognized instantly, she told me once, the first time I described my own father's reaction to culinary school. Every generation has its version of the same closed door, she said. Mine was a father who thought cooking was beneath serious ambition. Yours was a father who thought it was beneath medicine specifically. The shape changes, the door closing sounds exactly the same. She'd built her own career, decades earlier, entirely without her father's blessing, and I think some part of her recognized, in me, a version of the fight she'd once had to have alone, which is perhaps why she invested in me more deeply than she strictly needed to as my employer. She became, over the following 4 years, the mentor my own family had refused to be, teaching me not just technique, but the actual business of running a kitchen. The finances, the staffing, the relentless attention to detail that separates a good cook from someone capable of eventually running their own restaurant. I opened my own restaurant, Virat, 7 years ago, in a converted warehouse space in a neighborhood most investors told me was too far from the established dining corridors to succeed, funded through a combination of my own savings, a small business loan, and a modest investment from Odile herself, who believed in the concept before almost anyone else did. I want to be honest that the first 2 years of Virat were genuinely precarious. Several months where I genuinely wondered whether the restaurant would survive. Nights spent doing the books myself at 2 in the morning, after a full dinner service, learning through direct, expensive trial exactly how unforgiving the restaurant business can be to anyone, without significant outside capital behind them. Everything changed 4 years ago, when a respected regional food critic, writing anonymously for one of the city's most influential publications, dined at Virat on an unremarkable Tuesday evening and wrote a review that used the word transcendent twice in 3 paragraphs. Reservations, which had been steady but unremarkable before that review, became genuinely impossible to secure within a month. 18 months later, Virat received its first Michelin star. Last year, a second star followed, placing Virat among a genuinely small handful of 2-star restaurants in the entire region, and I'd since expanded carefully into a small restaurant group, a more casual bistro concept 2 years old, and a cocktail bar attached to Virat itself that had become, in its own right, a genuine destination. A cookbook deal, negotiated the previous spring, was set to publish that coming fall. Odile came to Virat's second star celebration dinner, 71 years old by then, and slowing down from her own restaurant work, and I remember her pulling me aside that night, gripping my hand with the same fierce intensity she'd shown me during my hardest early years. "You built this without a single person from your own blood in the room," she told me. "I want you to understand what that actually means. Most people who achieve something like this have at least someone from their original family cheering from a table somewhere. You built 2 Michelin stars entirely on borrowed family. Me, your staff, the people who chose to believe in you when your own blood wouldn't. That's a specific, rare kind of strength, Ada Ora, and I don't want you to ever mistake it for something ordinary." I've thought about that specific framing often in the months since the wedding, understanding that whatever reconciliation might eventually happen with my actual family, the family I built through Virat itself had already given me everything I once assumed only blood relatives could provide. None of that mattered to my father, standing in that reception hall 12 years after he'd disowned me. To him, I was still, permanently, frozen in time as the daughter who'd walked away from medicine, and walking away from medicine, in the Whitfield family's specific, unforgiving arithmetic, only ever meant one thing: failure, full stop, regardless of what had actually happened in the years since. I hadn't seen any of them since that final Christmas card 12 years earlier. Not one holiday, not one phone call, not even news secondhand through the small, insular medical community that occasionally intersected with my own social circles in ways I'd learned, over the years, to simply let pass without comment. The wedding that brought us into the same reception hall was pure, almost absurd coincidence. My old college roommate Priya Fernandez marrying a man named Trent Ashworth, whose best friend, it turned out, had attended medical school alongside my brother Marcus, creating an overlapping guest list neither Priya nor I had any reason to anticipate until the seating chart was already finalized. I almost didn't go once I realized from the wedding program itself that my family would be present. I called my old roommate the week before, genuinely torn, and she told me, gently, that she'd understand completely if I wanted to skip it, but that she also thought, if I was being honest with myself, that some part of me might actually want the chance to simply be in the same room as them again, on my own terms, 12 years into a life they'd never once bothered to check on. I spent that entire week going back and forth, calling Odile for advice one evening, sitting with the decision alone the next. Odile, characteristically direct, told me the choice was simpler than I was making it. "You've built an entire life without their permission," she said. "Going to that wedding doesn't hand them any power over you. Not going gives their absence more weight than it deserves. Go as the woman you actually became, not the girl they disowned." I sat with that framing for several more days before finally deciding, and I want to be honest, that even walking into that reception hall, I still felt a flicker of the same nervous uncertainty I'd carried at 19, telling my parents I wasn't applying to medical school after all. I decided to go. I want to be honest that I didn't go with any grand plan of confrontation or vindication. I went because Priya was one of my oldest, dearest friends, and because some quiet part of me was genuinely curious what 12 years had done to a family I'd once known so completely, and now knew not at all. If you're still with me, this is where it actually happens. Make sure you're subscribed, because what my father said next, and what came out about 20 minutes later, is the whole reason I'm telling you this story. I saw them the moment I walked into the reception hall, seated together at a table near the front, exactly the way I remembered them arranging themselves at every family gathering of my childhood. My father at the head, commanding the conversation, my mother beside him, my siblings arranged by birth order. A formation so familiar it produced an almost physical jolt of memory. I took my assigned seat at a table near the back, deliberately distant. And I want to be honest that my heart was pounding in a way I hadn't expected. 12 years of careful, deliberate distance, suddenly collapsing the moment I was breathing the same air as all four of them again. It was during the reception, well into the second hour, drinks flowing freely, that my father spotted me across the room. I watched him say something to my mother, watched her turn to look, watched the recognition land on both their faces in real time. He crossed the room directly, my siblings trailing behind him with the same automatic, formation-following instinct I remembered from childhood, and he stopped at my table, looking down at me with an expression I recognized instantly. The specific, pleased superiority he'd always carried when he believed he held every advantage in a room. "Look what we have here," he said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to turn, gesturing at me the way you might gesture at an exhibit. "This is the one who couldn't cut it in medicine." My mother smiled faintly into her wineglass, not correcting him, not defending me. Exactly the same silent complicity I remembered from 12 years earlier. Odalise and Priya laughed along, the easy, practiced laugh of people enjoying a familiar family bit. Marcus, I noticed, didn't laugh quite as readily as the others, something closer to discomfort crossing his face, before he smoothed it back into the family formation. I noticed a few of the nearby guests exchange uncomfortable glances, the specific discomfort of witnesses, to a cruelty dressed up as a joke, unsure whether to laugh along or look away. My old roommate Priya, the bride herself, caught my eye from several tables away during a brief lull in her own reception duties, her face carrying an expression of genuine concern, clearly having overheard enough of the exchange to understand something painful was unfolding at her own wedding. I gave her a small, reassuring nod, letting her know I was all right, that this was mine to handle rather than hers to rescue. I smiled back. I didn't correct him, not yet. I've learned, in 12 years of building something entirely my own, that correcting people who've already decided who you are rarely changes anything in the moment. The truth does that on its own, eventually, when it's finally ready to. It was ready about 20 minutes later, when the venue's catering director, a nervous, earnest young man named Foster Kowalski, approached our table directly, weaving carefully between guests with the particular urgency of someone delivering important news. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "I'm so sorry to interrupt, but the head chef wanted me to ask, Is it all right if he comes out to say hello? He's been dying to meet you all night. He trained under you at Virat before he took this position. My father blinked, genuinely confused by the sentence. Chef, he said. You know the chef here? She did. Is the chef, Foster said, visibly puzzled by the question, as though the confusion in front of him made no sense given how obvious the answer seemed to him. I mean, she's Chef Whitfield, Virat on Delancey, 2 Michelin stars. My boss talks about her tasting menu like it's scripture. He said working under her for those 2 years taught him more than his entire culinary degree combined. For 20. The table went very quiet, the particular quiet that settles over a room when several people are recalculating the same piece of information at once. My mother set down her wine glass slowly. My siblings, 3 surgeons who had spent 12 years assuming I was scraping by somewhere in an unglamorous kitchen job, stared at me like I'd somehow changed shape in front of them without moving at all. 2 Michelin stars, my father repeated slowly, the words visibly not fitting together correctly in his mouth. A man encountering information that contradicted 12 years of settled certainty, all at once. 4 years for the first star, I said, keeping my voice level, the same calm register I use running a dinner service through a crisis. Last year, the second. I also run 2 other locations under the same restaurant group, and I'm publishing a cookbook this fall. I'd have told you all of this myself, over the years, but you stopped taking my calls 12 years ago, right around the time you decided culinary school made me a failure worth disowning. Nobody at that table laughed this time. My father sat there for a long moment, the same man who had built his entire identity, and by extension his children's identities, around the singular measure of medical achievement, visibly recalculating 12 years of unquestioned certainty, in real time, in front of a room full of wedding guests who had, by now, noticed something significant was unfolding at our table. I didn't know any of this, he said finally, quieter than I'd ever once heard him speak in 34 years of knowing him. You didn't ask, I said. That's rather different, Dad. You disowned me over a decision you never once tried to understand, and then you spent 12 years assuming the outcome without a single phone call to check whether your assumption held up. My mother spoke then, for the first time since spotting me across the room, her voice smaller than I remembered it. We thought, your father thought, that walking away from medicine meant walking away from any real future. We genuinely believed that, Ada Ora. I don't say that as an excuse. I say it because I think you deserve to understand that we weren't simply being cruel for its own sake. We were operating on a belief we'd never once questioned, the same belief your father's own father raised him on. That doesn't make the 12 years of silence hurt any less, I told her, honestly. Belief or not, you all made a choice, every single day for 12 years, not to call, not to ask, not to find out whether the daughter you'd disowned was actually thriving or actually struggling. That silence was a choice, renewed daily, regardless of what belief originally started it. Marcus spoke up then, quietly, the first time he'd said anything since crossing the room. I thought about calling you, more than once, over the years, he admitted. I never did, because I didn't want to be the one who broke ranks with Dad. I think that's its own kind of cowardice looking back. I'm sorry, Eudora, genuinely. I appreciated that honesty more than I expected to, though it didn't undo 12 years in a single sentence at a wedding reception. Odalis and Priya, for their part, seemed considerably less prepared to reckon with what had just surfaced, both of them quieter than usual for the remainder of the evening, occasionally glancing toward me with an expression I couldn't fully read, somewhere between embarrassment and genuine reassessment. The head chef, a warm, earnest man named Julian, who'd indeed trained under me at Virat for 2 formative years before taking his current position, came out to greet me properly a few minutes later, entirely unaware of the family drama his simple, friendly gesture had just detonated. He spent several minutes telling my family, unprompted and with genuine enthusiasm, about specific techniques he'd learned under my direction, about the exacting standards I'd held the kitchen to, about how transformative those 2 years had been for his own career. I watched my father listen to every word with an expression I'd never once seen on his face in 34 years. Something that looked, unmistakably, like humility. I want to be honest, that I felt no triumph in that moment, watching Julian's earnest praise land on a family that had spent 12 years assuming I'd failed. I felt only a strange, tired clarity, the specific feeling of watching a truth arrive on its own timeline, entirely outside my own control, in a room I hadn't chosen, and through a messenger who had no idea what he was actually delivering. I didn't build Virat to prove my father wrong. I want to be completely honest about that, because it matters to how I understand the last 12 years of my own life. I built it because I loved the work, because a kitchen made sense to me in a way an operating room never once had, and because Odile Marchand had shown me, during those exhausting early years, that mastery built through genuine passion produces something no amount of inherited family pressure ever could. The fact that Virat also happened to outperform, by any reasonable financial measure, my father's own celebrated medical career was simply the truth finally catching up to a story he'd told himself 12 years too early, without ever once bothering to check whether it held. My father called me 2 weeks after that wedding, the first phone call between us in 12 years. I almost didn't answer, letting it ring twice before finally picking up. "I've been sitting with what happened at that wedding," he said, his voice carrying none of its usual commanding certainty. "I think I owe you considerably more than a phone call, but I wanted to start somewhere." We talked for nearly an hour that evening, longer than any single conversation we'd had in the final years before my disowning even began. He asked, haltingly, about the years he'd missed, how I'd actually survived those early, precarious years in New York, who had helped me when he hadn't, what it had actually felt like receiving that first Michelin star without a single member of my own family there to celebrate it with me. I told him honestly, without softening it for his comfort, that I'd cried alone in my apartment the night that first star was announced, not entirely out of joy, but out of a specific, complicated grief that the people who should have been proudest of me had no idea it was even happening. "I think I need you to understand something," he said, near the end of that call, his voice breaking slightly, in a way I'd never once heard from him in 34 years. "I've spent 30 years building a reputation in this hospital, in this community, around a very narrow definition of success. I think some part of me was afraid that if I let your choice count as legitimate, it would mean questioning the entire framework I'd built my own life and my own children's lives around. It was easier to call you a failure than to sit with the possibility that the framework itself might have been too narrow all along." I told him honestly that I appreciated him calling, and that I wasn't interested in immediately restoring the relationship to what it once was, 12 years being too long a silence to simply paper over with a single wedding reveal and a single phone call. I told him I was open to slowly, carefully rebuilding something, on terms that acknowledged what those 12 years had actually cost me, rather than pretending they'd simply been a misunderstanding easily resolved. We're talking again now, cautiously, a few months into what I understand to be a genuinely slow process. My father visited Virat for the first time about 6 weeks ago, sitting quietly through an entire tasting menu, and I watched him, from the kitchen pass, taste dishes I'd spent years developing with an expression I'd never once seen him wear watching any of his children's medical achievements, something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine wonder. He told me afterward, in the kind of halting, uncertain voice I'd never associated with him before, that he understood now, watching an entire dining room move through a service I'd built from nothing, exactly what kind of mastery he'd spent 12 years dismissing as a lesser choice. I want to describe what's happened with each of my siblings individually since that wedding, because the reconciliation, such as it is, hasn't moved at the same pace or in the same direction for any of them. Marcus reached out again about a month after his initial admission at the reception, asking if we could get coffee, just the two of us, away from the rest of the family. We met at a quiet cafe near his hospital, and he told me, more fully than he had that night, that watching his own children grow older had made him newly aware of exactly how much silent conformity he'd absorbed from our father throughout his own life, and that he didn't want to model that same conformity for his own kids. "I want my daughter to see that I can admit when I was wrong," he told me, even 12 years too late. We've had coffee twice more since, slowly rebuilding something that feels, for the first time in over a decade, like an actual relationship rather than an inherited family formation. Priya's path has been slower and more halting. She called me about 2 months after the wedding, and I could hear, in her voice, someone still working through exactly how much of her adult understanding of me had been built on a story she'd never independently examined. "I think I need to actually get to know you," she told me, "instead of just knowing the story about you I grew up with." We've exchanged a handful of careful texts since, nothing yet resembling the closeness Marcus and I have started rebuilding, but I've come to understand that Priya's slower pace isn't distance so much as genuine, honest uncertainty about how to relate to a sister she's realizing she never actually knew. Odalise, of everyone in the family, has remained the most distant, still largely deferring to our father's original framing, even months after the reception, and I've made peace, at least for now, with the possibility that her reconciliation, if it comes at all, may take considerably longer than anyone else's. I don't hold that against her the way I once might have. 12 years of unquestioned certainty doesn't dissolve on the same timeline for everyone, and I've learned, through this entire process, that genuine reconciliation can't be rushed simply because one dramatic reveal at a wedding made the rest of the family's timeline move faster. I think about that reception hall often, the exact pleased certainty in my father's voice when he pointed at me and told the room I couldn't cut it in medicine. What strikes me most, looking back, is that I never once needed to raise my voice to correct 12 years of that certainty. The truth simply arrived on its own timeline, through an earnest young sous chef who had no idea he was detonating anything at all, in the one room where my father's easy dismissal finally collided, publicly, with everything he'd never once bothered to check. I've thought a great deal, in the months since, about what it actually means to build an entire adult identity in the complete absence of the family that raised you. There's a specific, particular strength that comes from that isolation, one I don't think I'd have developed if my father had simply supported my choice from the beginning. A fierce, self-reliant resolve that doesn't depend on external validation because it was built, out of necessity, entirely without any. I don't say this to excuse the 12 years of silence, which I still consider a genuine, unnecessary cruelty that cost all of us more than my father seems to fully grasp even now. But I've come to understand that the specific shape of resilience I built during those years, the ability to trust my own judgment completely, without needing a single external voice to confirm I was on the right path, has become one of the most valuable assets I carry into every single decision I make running Virat today. I turned 34 this year, and I hosted a small dinner at the restaurant to celebrate, closing the dining room to the public for one evening, gathering Odile, my closest kitchen staff, a handful of old friends from those difficult early years in Queens, and, for the first time in 12 years, my father, who came alone, my mother still working through her own slower reckoning with everything the wedding had surfaced. He raised a quiet, halting toast that evening, nothing like the booming, confident speeches I remembered from childhood family gatherings, and told the small assembled group that he was still learning, at 61 years old, exactly how narrow his own definition of success had been, and that he was grateful, later than he had any right to expect gratitude, for the chance to finally understand what his daughter had actually built. If your family has ever decided who you were and stopped checking whether it stayed true, I hope you remember this. The years you spend building something real, quietly, on your own terms, don't need anyone's permission to eventually speak for themselves. I think, too, about all the other versions of this story that never get a wedding reception moment of clean, public reckoning, the countless people who build something genuinely worthwhile in complete isolation from family, who decided, based on a single choice made decades earlier, exactly who they'd turn out to be, without ever once revising that verdict. Not every story gets an earnest young sous chef showing up at exactly the right moment to detonate 12 years of unexamined certainty. I got lucky, in a sense, that the truth found its moment so cleanly and so publicly. I think the deeper lesson, underneath the satisfying specifics of how mine happened to unfold, is that the actual value of what you build was never contingent on anyone else witnessing it at all. Virat was worth building whether or not my father ever set foot in it. The 12 years of mastery I developed under Odile's guidance mattered whether or not a single Whitfield ever tasted a plate I'd created. I built something real because it was real, and the reckoning that eventually came was simply a bonus, not the actual point of any of it. Tell me in the comments what your own family got wrong about you, and how long it took, if it ever came at all, for the truth to finally catch up. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you haven't already, hit subscribe right now. Silent Revenge posts more stories like this one every week, about the quiet people who finally get to be seen exactly as they are, and you won't want to miss the next one. I'll see you there.